Hello everyone, this is Pushpoint, and I am your storyteller. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. Like the video and subscribe the channel.
After where are you from and what time you are watching now, get comfortable and relax. Story 1. The Lantern Keeper. A cold mist clung to the stones of Crackmore Lighthouse as Arthur Braithwaite climbed the winding stairs, each step echoing with the groan of ancient wood.
It had been years since he'd taken up his father's post as the lighthouse keeper, a lonely, thankless job, but one that suited his quiet nature.
The light, perched atop the cliff like a solitary isle, had guided countless ships through the fog-shrouded waters of the North Sea. But tonight, the sea seemed different, angrier, its black waves crashing against the rocks with a savage ferocity.
As he reached the top, Arthur paused to catch his breath, the lantern's steady beam casting his long, twisted shadow against the cracked walls. He moved to polish the glass, but his hand froze.
Through the rain-streaked window, he saw it, a figure, barely visible, clinging to the rocks below. He grabbed his spyglass, his pulse quickening.
The figure remained motionless, head bowed as the sea churned around it. Arthur's mind raced.
How had someone managed to get that far down without being swept away?
He leaned closer, trying to make out any details in the flickering light. The figure lifted its head, and even from this distance, Arthur felt the cold stab of its gaze. Hours passed, yet the figure remained, unmoved by the relentless tide. Arthur lit his old pipe, the bitter smoke filling his lungs as he tried to convince himself it was just a trick of the mist, a shadow cast by the waves.
But when the storm finally broke and dawn's weak light crept over the horizon, the figure was gone, leaving nothing but the jagged rocks and the distant call of gulls.
That night, as the wind howled and the waves clawed at the cliffs, Arthur heard it, a soft, rasping whisper beneath the creak of the tower's bones. It seemed to echo from the walls themselves, each gust of wind carrying fragments of words he couldn't quite grasp. In the coming weeks, the whispers grew louder, clawing into his dreams, weaving themselves into the sigh of the sea and the groan of the lighthouse. Arthur found himself avoiding his reflection in the fogged glass, his own hollow-eyed stare a reminder of the figure on the rocks.
Then, one storm-lashed night, the whispers ceased. Arthur clutched his lantern, its weak light flickering, as he crept up the stairs. As he reached the top, his breath caught.
The glass was shattered, sea spray coating the floor.
And there, in the fractured reflection of the cracked glass, he saw it, a shadow, twisted and waiting, its empty eyes fixed upon him.
Arthur backed away, but the door slammed shut, the ancient hinges groaning like a dying man's last breath. He stumbled back against the wall, his lantern shattering on the stones, casting the room into darkness.
Outside, the waves crashed harder, and the whispers returned, no longer faint, but a rising chorus that filled the tower, calling to him, pulling at his very soul.
As the light sputtered and died, Arthur felt the cold embrace of the sea reach for him, and he knew, with a sickening certainty, that he would never leave the lighthouse again.
Story 2. The Watcher in the Pines.
The cabin sat deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, where the trees grew thick and twisted, their roots gnarled like the fingers of 100 buried hands.
Mia had rented it for the solitude, a place to finish her novel, far from the city's ceaseless noise. The first few days were perfect.
She spent mornings sipping coffee on the creaking porch, watching the mist weave through the pines, and nights by the crackling fire, her laptop humming with fresh pages. But on the third evening, as the rain pattered against the roof, Mia noticed something strange, a shadow among the trees.
At first, she thought it a trick of the flickering firelight, or perhaps a deer slipping through the underbrush.
But as she leaned closer to the window, she saw it, a figure, tall and thin, standing motionless between the twisted trunks. She stepped back, her breath catching. The figure was just watching, no lantern, no coat to shield it from the icy rain, just a dark shape, its head slightly tilted as if it could see right through the glass.
Mia closed the curtain, her pulse drumming in her ears.
She tried to shake off the unease, forcing herself back to her writing, but the words felt hollow, tainted by the figure's silent vigil.
The next morning, she found no sign of the figure, no footprints in the mud, no broken branches,
just the wet, tangled forest whispering in the wind.
But that night, as the rain returned, so did the figure closer this time. Standing just at the edge of the clearing, its head still tilted, one arm slightly outstretched, fingers curled into the fork. Mia locked the door and drew every curtain tight.
She tried calling the rental office, but the line crackled with static, her voice swallowed by the storm. Days passed, each night bringing the figure a step closer.
It never moved when she watched, yet every morning it seemed closer, its outline sharper, more defined against the gnarled pines.
Then, on the 7th night, the rain stopped.
The world outside fell into a deep, suffocating silence, broken only by the soft creak of the cabin's old board. Mia sat frozen, her laptop casting pale light across her trembling hands.
A shadow slipped across the window. Mia forced herself to look, her heart racing, and her breath caught in her throat. The figure stood inches from the glass now, its face obscured, long, dripping fingers pressed against the cold pane. It cocked its head, and she swore she felt its breath against the glass, the fork of its exhale mingling with her own. Then, slowly, it raised one hand, a single finger tapping the glass in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap.
Mia stumbled back, knocking her chair over as the light flickered. When she looked again, the window was empty.
Just her own pale, wide-eyed reflection staring back at her. The door creaked open behind her. Story 3.
The house that remembers. The house on Ashen Lane had stood empty for decades, its windows like dark, unblinking eyes, its sagging porch a toothless grin. Liam had passed it countless times as a child, always keeping his distance. The whispered tales of its haunted halls a staple of the neighborhood.
But when his grandfather passed, leaving the house in his will, Liam found himself standing before its rusted gate, a battered key clutched in his trembling hand. The air felt heavy here, thick with the scent of wet leaves and rotting wood.
As he pushed open the gate, the hinges screamed, the sound echoing through the overgrown yard.
He shivered, though the evening air was warm.
Inside, the house felt alive, each creaking board and distant drip of water like the slow, patient heartbeat of something ancient. Dust coated every surface, thick enough to swallow the light from his flashlight, which cut weakly through the shadows. The first night, Lion slept in the parlor, his sleeping bag unrolled beneath the cracked portrait of his great-grandfather. He dreamed of hollow-eyed figures standing at the foot of his bed, whispering his name in slow, drawn-out breaths. He woke, gasping, the cold air pressing against his damp skin.
His flashlight flickered weakly in the corner, its beam illuminating the cracked ceiling.
He strained to hear, his pulse pounding in his ears, and there it was, a soft, dragging sound from the floor above. Liam's breath caught.
He fumbled for the flashlight, its beam jittering as he swept it across the room. The smoke swirled like ash in the faint light, and the portraits on the wall seemed to lean in, their painted eyes sharper, more focused.
He forced himself up the stairs, each step creaking beneath his weight, the air growing colder with every step.
At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness, its walls lined with doorways that yawned like open mouths. From the far end, a shadow moved.
Liam froze, his light catching the barest flicker of something slipping into one of the rooms, a flash of pale skin, long matted hair. His pulse raced as he inched closer, every instant screaming at him to turn back. He reached the door, its paint peeling in long, scab-like strips. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside.
The room was empty. Dust-covered furniture lay shrouded in white sheets, the corners of the fabric swaying gently as if recently disturbed.
He swept the beam across the room, the shadows stretching, twisting around his feet.
Then, the door behind him slammed shut.
Liam whipped around, his flashlight flickering wildly.
The air felt thick, suffocating, and he realized with a sickening lurch that he was not alone.
He turned slowly, the light catching on the mirror in the corner. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't his face.
The eyes were too dark, the mouth twisted into a grin that stretched too wide. The reflection stepped forward, and in the darkness, the house sighed, a deep, contented sound, as if welcoming him home.
Story 4. The whispering well.
The well had always been there, hidden deep in the woods behind the old farmhouse.
Anna first discovered it as a child, its crumbling stones and rusted iron grate half buried beneath a snarl of roots and dead leaves. Her grandmother had warned her never to go near it.
Things fall in, and sometimes they come back, she had whispered, her eyes distant, fingers twisting the fraying edge of her shawl. Anna had forgotten about the well for years, her childhood curiosity dulled by the weight of adulthood and the steady march of time. But when her grandmother passed and the farmhouse became hers, the memories came flooding back. She returned, standing once more at the edge of the old stone circle, peering into the darkness below. She expected silence, perhaps the echo of her own breath, but instead she heard a voice soft, whispering, like a breeze weaving through dead leaves. Anna, she stumbled back, her pulse racing, the cold air clinging to her skin.
She peered again, half expecting to see a face rising from the darkness, but the well remained empty, its depths shrouded in shadows.
Days turned to weeks, but the whispers persisted. They followed her through the house, drifting up through the floorboards, seeping through the walls.
At night, they grew louder, more insistent, until Anna found herself standing at the window, staring out at the moonlit woods, her breath fogging the glass.
One night, unable to stand it any longer, she took a lantern and followed the overgrown path to the well.
The wind hissed through the branches, their shadows stretching like skeletal fingers across the forest floor.
The whispers grew clearer as she approached, each step sending dry leaves crunching beneath her boots. She reached the edge of the well, its stones cold beneath her hands, and leaned in, the lantern casting a faint, flickering glow into the depths.
Anna,
come back.
The voice was louder now, clearer.
It was her grandmother's voice, the same rasping whisper that had once sung her to sleep in the darkened farmhouse. Trembling, Anna lowered the lantern, its light slicing through the shadows, and gasped. At the bottom of the well, she saw it a figure, pale and twisted, its face turned up towards her, mouth stretched wide in a silent scream.
She stumbled back, dropping the lantern, its glass shattering against the stones. Darkness rushed out from the well, swallowing the light, and the whispers rose, a chaotic chorus that filled her mind, their words tangled and desperate. As she turned to run, the iron grate creaked, its rusted hinges groaning as it swung open on its own.
The whispers followed her through the trees, their voices growing fainter as she stumbled back towards the farmhouse. That night, as she bolted the door and locked every window, Anna heard the slow, deliberate creak of the iron grate, followed by the crunch of footsteps on dead leaves, growing closer and closer.
And as she clutched the blanket to her chest, the whispers returned, curling through the cracks in the walls, echoing through the empty halls. Anna,
you shouldn't have looked.
Story 5. The Room of Forgotten Echoes.
The old manor on Briar Hill had always been an eyesore, its towering, ivy-choked walls looming over the fog-drenched countryside. When Daniel inherited it from his estranged great-uncle, he saw it as a chance to start fresh, a place to escape the failures and disappointments that haunted his every step.
The first few days were a blur of dust and echoes, his footsteps muffled by threadbare carpets and the creak of ancient wood.
The house seemed to breathe around him, the distant clatter of settling beams and the whisper of drafts through cracked windows creating an unsettling symphony.
Then, one evening, as the rain lashed against the tall, arched windows, Daniel found it the room at the end of the second-floor hallway, hidden behind a door he swore hadn't been there before.
The door was narrow, its paint peeling in long, twisted strips like dead skin.
Daniel hesitated, his hand hovering over the tarnished brass handle, his breath misting in the cold air.
The hallway seemed to stretch behind him, the shadows bending, leaning in.
He turned the handle.
The room beyond was small, its walls lined with shelves filled with cracked porcelain dolls and twisted, rusted metal trinkets. Cobwebs clung to every corner, the air thick with the scent of mold and something older, something metallic and sour.
As he stepped inside, the door creaked shut behind him, the sound echoing through the narrow space like the snap of a jaw. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The room felt
wrong, too small, the walls pressing in, the air colder than the rest of the house. Then, slowly, the whispers began.
They rose from the shadows, soft at first, like the rustle of dry leaves, then louder, voices overlapping, each tangled and desperate.
Daniel stumbled back, his pulse racing as the whispers grew clearer. "Help us, don't look. It sees you." The dolls on the shelves seemed to shift, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. One of them, a pale figure with a cracked porcelain face, its mouth stretched into a too wide grin, slowly turned its head towards him. Daniel staggered back, his shoulders slamming into the wall, the breath punched from his lungs as the whispers grew louder. A rising tide of fear and pain. He reached for the door, his fingers fumbling against the cold brass handle. It wouldn't turn. The whispers closed in, the shadows tightening, the doll's eyes following him, their grins stretching wider.
With a final desperate shove, the door burst open, and Daniel stumbled back into the hallway, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The door slammed shut behind him, the whispers cut off as suddenly as they had begun. He stared at the door, the paint now whole and unbroken, the handle polished and smooth.
He stepped back, his pulse thundering in his ears, and turned to flee.
But as he reached the stairs, he paused, his heart sinking.
The whispers had followed him, slipping through the walls, their voices twisted with laughter, calling his name.
And in the darkness behind him, the door slowly creaked open once more. Story 6. The Last Train Home.
The train station at Ashfield Junction had been abandoned for decades, its rusting tracks swallowed by weeds and the cracked platform covered in a thick layer of grime.
Mia had missed the last bus out of town and, desperate for a way home, stumbled upon the old station by accident. The rain had turned the streets into rivers, the air sharp with the scent of wet asphalt and rust.
She ducked beneath the crumbling awning, her breath misting in the cold air, and hesitated. A single light flickered at the end of the platform, casting long, twisted shadows that danced along the graffiti street walls.
As she moved closer, her footsteps echoing of the cracked tiles, she noticed it a train, its dark, hulking shape barely visible in the fog. The windows were black, the metal side streaked with rust and something darker, something sticky.
She frowned. The station had been closed for years.
No trains run here anymore. Yet the door to the nearest carriage slid open with a hiss. Warm, camp hair rushing out to meet her. A faint, echoing voice crackled through the overhead speakers.
All aboard. Mia's heart raced.
She peered into the carriage, the faint light revealing worn, cracked seats and darkened windows. She took a hesitant step inside, the door hissing shut behind her.
The air was thick, oppressive, each breath like swallowing wet cotton. She moved down the aisle, her eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering lights. The seats were empty, but the faint, musty scent of old perfume and cigarette smoke clung to the air, mingling with the metallic tang of rust.
As she reached the center of the carriage, the train lurched forward, the wheels screeching against the rusty tracks.
Mia stumbled, grabbing the back of a seat, her pulse racing. The windows blurred as the train picked up speed, the world outside a smear of darkness and rain-streaked glass. She glanced around, her breath catching as she noticed the seats were no longer empty. Figures, twisted and hunched, filled the rows, their faces hidden beneath wide-brimmed hats and heavy coats. They swayed with the motion of the train, their breaths slow and rattling, fogging the air. Mia took a step back, her heart thundering in her chest. She turned to run, but the aisle stretched, the exit a distant, impossible point of light. She stumbled, the floor beneath her feet growing soft and damp, like decaying leaves. The figures turned, their heads creaking slowly, and she saw their faces pale, hollow-eyed, their mouths stretched into wide, silent screams. She bolted, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the sound of whispering voices filling her mind, their words tangled and desperate. As she reached the door, it hissed open, and she stumbled out onto the platform, the rain-soaked tiles cold beneath her hands. She turned, gasping for air, but the train was gone, the tracks empty, the lights dead. Mia staggered back, her pulse hammering in her ears, and realized with a sickening lurch that the platform was different, now older,
the walls covered in dark, dripping stains, their air thick with the scent of rock.
She turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw them figures, their faces hidden, standing along the platform's edge, their hollow eyes fixed on her.
And behind her, the faint, metallic screech of a train's wheels on rusted tracks grew louder. Story 7. The Forgotten Cellar.
The old farmhouse had been in Olivia's family for generations, its sagging roof and cracked windows a testament to years of storms and neglect. She inherited it after her mother's sudden passing, the will a single, creased piece of paper left in an old, locked box.
Clearing the house had been a daunting task, dust-coated furniture, yellow and wallpaper peeling from the walls, and the slow, steady drip of a leaky faucet echoing through the empty halls.
But it was the cellar that truly unnerved her.
The door was small, hidden behind a stack of rotting firewood in the kitchen, its iron latch cold and rusted, the wood swollen with years of damp.
She almost missed it, her flashlight beam catching the faint outline as she dragged a chair across the creaking floor.
She hesitated, her breath forking in the cold air. Something about the door felt wrong, like it hadn't been touched in decades. The faint, sour scent of damp earth wafted up from the crack beneath it. Olivia grasped the latch, her fingers slipping on the rusted metal, and pulled. The door groaned open, a wave of cold, stale air rolling up from the darkness below.
She fumbled for the flashlight, its weak beam barely cutting through the thick, swirling dust.
The stairs creaked beneath her weight, each step sending puffs of mold into the air.
The walls were rough stone, the floor packed dirt, the ceiling low enough that she had to hunch as she descended. The cellar stretched farther than she expected, its shadows twisting around the thick wooden beams, the air growing colder with each step. She reached the bottom and swung the flashlight in a slow arc, the beam catching on something glinting in the corner. Chains, thick, rusted chains, bolted to the wall, their ends frayed and twisted. She frowned, moving closer, her pulse quickening as the beam revealed deep scratches in the stone, the marks gouged into the wall as if something had fought desperately to escape.
A sudden creak from above made her freeze, her breath catching in her throat. She swung the light back towards the stairs, but they remained empty, the shadows shifting like restless whispers. Then, from the darkness behind her, a soft, shuffling sound. Olivia looked around, the flashlight trembling in her hand. The beam caught through the thick dust, catching the barest glimpse of movement, a twisted, hunched shape sliding into the deeper shadows, the faint, wet sound of breathing echoing of the stone.
She stumbled back, her heart racing, her pulse a deafening drumbeat in her ears. She swung the light again, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The chains clinked, the sound sharp and metallic, like the rattle of old bones. Without a second thought, she turned and fled, her footsteps thundering up the creaking stairs, the shadows stretching, reaching for her as she burst back into the kitchen, slamming the door behind her.
She leaned against it, her breath coming in ragged gulps, her hands shaking.
And then, from the darkness below, the faint, muffled sound of chains rattling,
followed by a single, rasping breath. Story 8. The Hollow Path. When the old logging road reappeared behind Cedar Lake, the locals whispered that the woods were reclaiming their own. Trees had grown over the crumbling asphalt, their twisted roots cracking the pavement, the canopy above so dense that even sunlight struggled to pierce through. Eli had heard the stories growing up, the whispers of the hollow path, a place where hunters disappeared, where shadows stretched too long, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting leaves. But he had never believed them.
Not until now. He stumbled upon the path while hiking one overcast afternoon, his boots slipping on the marsh-slick stones, the air cold against his damp skin. He hesitated, his pulse quickening as the wind rustled through the branches, the leaves whispering like the soft, secret voices of the dead.
Curiosity pulled him forward. He pushed through the thick underbrush, his breath forking in the cool air, and stepped onto the path. The air grew colder, the trees taller, their branches reaching like twisted, skeletal fingers towards the grey sky. The ground beneath his feet felt softer, each step sinking slightly, as if the earth itself resisted his presence. As he moved deeper, The sounds of the forest faded, the rustle of leaves and distant call of birds swallowed by a thick, suffocating silence.
He paused, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, and glanced back. The path had disappeared behind him, the dense underbrush closing in like the jaws of a trap. Panic flickered at the edge of his mind, but he forced himself forward, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows against the twisted trunks. The air grew heavier, the damp earth releasing the thick, cloying scent of decay.
Then he saw it.
A figure, barely visible through the mist, standing just off the path, its head bowed, long, twisted limbs stretched at unnatural angles. Eli froze, his pulse thundering in his ears as the figure slowly turned its head. Empty, hollow eyes locking onto his, he stumbled back, his flashlight flickering as the figure stepped closer, its movements slow, deliberate, each step pressing deep into the soft, wet earth. Eli turned and ran, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps, the air growing colder, the shadows reaching for him. The path twisted beneath his feet, the roots snagging his boots, branches clawing at his jacket. The whispers rose around him, soft and wet, like the sigh of a dying breath. He burst through the underbrush, his flashlight flickering, his lungs burning, and stumbled onto the lakeshore. He collapsed onto the wet sand, his heart hammering in his chest, the cold water lapping at his boots. When he looked back, the path was gone, the twisted trees and thick underbrush once again closing up the hollow. The whispers swallowed by the wind. Eli staggered to his feet, his breath coming in short, panicked gulps, and turned towards the parking lot. He never looked back, but as he reached his truck, his hand trembling on the door handle, he caught a glimpse of movement in the rearview mirror, a twisted, hollow-eyed figure standing at the edge of the woods, its head tilted, its mouth stretched into a wide, silent scream.
Story 9. The Whispering Fork.
The coastal village of Grey Harbor had always been shrouded in mist, its craggy cliffs and ancient stone cottages clinging to the edge of the sea like barnacles. Amelia had grown up here, the fork a constant presence in her life, curling around the rocky shoreline and swallowing the streets each evening. But this fog was different.
It rolled in one moonless night, thicker than she'd ever seen, its tendrils creeping through the village like silent, ghostly fingers.
The air grew colder, the waves below the cliffs crashing with a deep, hollow echo, as if the ocean itself had grown restless. Amelia pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her boots clicking against the wet cobblestones as she made her way home. The fork clung to her, cold and damp, muffling her footsteps. The gas lamps lining the street casting faint, shivering pools of light. As she passed the old churchyard, she heard it a soft whisper, like the rustle of dry leaves, the faint, ghostly echo of distant voices. She paused, her breath fogging in the chill air, and strained to listen. The whispers grew louder, a chaotic murmur of tangled words and broken pleas. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening as she realized the fog itself seemed to be moving, swirling around her feet, stretching towards the graves.
The cold seeped into her bones, her breath catching in her throat, as a shadow moved at the edge of her vision, a tall, thin figure, its head bowed, long, twisted limbs swaying in the damp air.
Amelia stumbled back, her boots slipping on the wet stones.
The figure raised its head, hollow, empty eyes locking onto hers, its mouth stretching wide in a silent scream. She turned and ran, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps, the fork thickening around her, the whispers rising to a fevered pitch.
The village felt smaller, the narrow streets twisting and turning, each corner revealing only more mist, more shadows, the echo of her own footsteps chasing her. She reached her front door, fumbling with the key, her pulse a frantic drumbeat in her ears. She slammed the door behind her, her back pressed against the cold wood, her breath coming in sharp, panicked bursts. The whispers faded, the fog pressing against the windows, swirling in slow, hypnotic spirals. She stumbled to the window, her fingers trembling as she pulled the curtain aside. The street outside was empty, the fog thick and still, the old gas lamps flickering weakly in the gloom.
But as she turned away, A soft, cold breath brushed against her neck. The whispering voices rising once more, closer now, their words clear, tangled with the damp, salty air.
Amelia, you never left.
Story 10. The Room That Waits.
The old boarding house on the outskirts of town had been abandoned for nearly a decade.
Its peeling paint and broken windows stood like hollow eyes overlooking the empty fields.
When Lucas moved in, he didn't mind the disrepair cheap rent was hard to come by, and the landlord seemed eager to have someone occupy the place. The house had a strange layout, long, narrow hallways that twisted like a labyrinth, and rooms that seemed to shift in size depending on the time of day. The other tenants kept to themselves, their doors always closed, and at night the building settled with loud, groaning creaks. But it was the room at the end of the second-floor hall that caught Lucas's attention.
The door was bolted shut, a faded "Do Not Enter" sign hanging crookedly. Curious, he asked the landlord about it.
Just storage, the old man replied curtly, his eyes darting to the stairs as if afraid the room could hear.
One evening, while cleaning the hallway, Lucas noticed something odd. The door to the forbidden room was slightly ajar, the rusty padlock hanging loose.
The hallway light flickered, and a cold draft seeped from the gap. Compelled by curiosity, he pushed the door open. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and something metallic. The room was small, windowless, the wallpaper peeling in long, curling strips.
In the center sat a single chair, facing the far wall, its wood splintered and darkened with age. As Lucas stepped inside, the floor creaked beneath his weight, the sound muffled, like footsteps trailing him.
He turned, expecting to see someone in the doorway, but the hall was empty. He moved closer to the chair, noticing strange symbols scratched into the floorboards. Around its circles intertwined, lines crossing at sharp angles.
Goosebumps prickled his skin, and he reached out, brushing dust from the back of the chair.
Suddenly, the door slammed shut. Lucas whipped around, heart pounding, and rushed to the door, but the knob wouldn't turn. Panic surged through him as the temperature plummeted, his breath fogging in the dim light.
Then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic creaking, like the swaying of a rocking chair.
He turned slowly, dread falling in his stomach.
The chair was moving on its own, scraping against the floor in slow, deliberate motions. A chill ran down his spine as he noticed something even worse. The symbols on the floor seemed to pulse, the lines shifting, rearranging themselves in slow, deliberate movements.
A whisper brushed against his ear, soft and cold. "Sit." Lucas backed against the door, pounding on it, yelling for help, but his voice seemed to vanish into the thick, suffocating air.
The chair continued to rock, the symbols swirling faster, merging into a dark, spiraling shape on the floor.
Desperate, Lucas kicked the door, throwing his weight against it, until the old wood finally gave way, and he stumbled into the hallway, gasping.
When he turned back, the room was dark, the door swinging slowly on its hinges, the whisper fading into silence. He ran to his room, locking himself inside, heart pounding in his chest.
That night, he heard the unmistakable sound of the chair rocking from the end of the hall, the rhythm slow and deliberate, never stopping. The next morning, the door was bolted shut again, the faded sign hanging crookedly, as if it had never moved. Lucas didn't stay long after that, but the sound of the rocking chair followed him, even after he left the soft creak echoing in his dreams, reminding him that some rooms never really stay empty. Story 11. The Mirror in the Attic. Emily had always hated her grandmother's house.
It sat at the edge of a dense, overgrown forest, its crooked roof and warped wooden walls leaning like an old, tired giant. When her grandmother passed, the house became hers, a sprawling, creaking maze of shadowed hallways and forgotten rooms.
She arrived one rainy evening, the wind howling through the trees, branches scratching against the windows like skeletal fingers. The air inside was cold, thick with the musty scent of dust and aged wood.
As she explored the house, memories surfaced, her grandmother's wrinkled hands knitting by the fire, the sharp crack of the old grandfather clock in the hallway, and the attic door, always locked, always forbidden.
It took her 2 days to find the key, hidden in the back of a rusted cookie tin in the kitchen. She stood at the base of the narrow attic stairs, the key cold in her palm, her breath misting in the chilled air. The stairs creaked beneath her weight, the narrow space pressing in around her, the walls lined with peeling wallpaper and thick, dangling cobwebs. The attic door loomed above her, its wood dark and cracked, the brass handles tarnished with age.
She hesitated, the key trembling in her hand, and then slid it into the lock. The door groaned open, a rush of cold, stale air hitting her, thick with the scent of dust and something metallic.
The attic was larger than she remembered, its slanted ceiling pressing down, the shadows long and twisted. She swept her flashlight across the cluttered space, old furniture draped in yellowed sheets, broken picture frames, boxes stacked like forgotten tombstones.
And then she saw it. A tall, ornate mirror leaned against the far wall, its glass cracked, the dark wood frame carved with twisted, swirling patterns that seemed to writhe in the dim light.
She stepped closer, her reflection flickering in the fractured glass.
As she approached, she noticed something odd. Her reflection didn't match her movements.
She froze, her pulse quickening as the figure in the mirror tilted its head, its eyes dark, its lips stretching into a slow, twisted grin. Emily stumbled back, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps.
She turned to flee, but the attic door slammed shut behind her, the lock clicking into place.
Panic surged through her as she turned back to the mirror. The reflection stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, its eyes dark, hollow, staring back at her with a silent, predatory hunger.
She pounded on the door, her fist slamming against the splintered wood, her scream swallowed by the thick, suffocating darkness.
When she turned back, the figure in the mirror was closer, its face twisted, its hands pressed against the inside of the glass, its mouth stretching wider, teeth sharp and glistening in the flickering light.
She felt a cold, sharp pain in her chest, her breath catching as the reflection reached out, its hand sliding through the glass, the surface rippling like dark, stagnant water. The last thing she saw before the darkness closed in was her own face, twisted and hollow-eyed, staring back at her from the other side of the glass, a silent, screaming echo trapped forever in the darkness. Story 12. The Watcher in the Cornfield. Sam had never liked the old farmhouse his uncle left him. It sat alone at the edge of a vast, swaying cornfield, the stalks tall and thick, whispering secrets in the wind. The house creaked and groaned as if remembering the years it had stood against the storms it swept across the plains. The first night, Sam heard it a faint, steady rustling from the corn, like footsteps dragging through the dry, brittle stalks.
He brushed it off as the wind, the creak of old wood settling, the distant call of a coyote. But the sound came again the next night, and the one after that, always just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the shadows stretching long across the fields.
It grew louder, the rustling more urgent, like something pushing its way through the dense, tangled rows, drawing closer. One evening, Sam stepped onto the back porch, his breath misting in the cool, damp air.
The wind whispered through the corn, the stalks swaying in slow, hypnotic waves.
He squinted into the darkness, his pulse quickening as the rustling grew louder, closer. Then he saw it.
A figure, tall and thin, its limbs twisted and bent, slowly making its way through the road. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, the long, dry corn leaves brushing against its ragged clothes, its movements slow, deliberate. Sam stumbled back, his boots clattering against the warped wood of the porch. He grabbed the old shotgun from the wall, his hands shaking as he aimed into the darkness. The figure paused, its head snapping up, empty, hollow eyes locking onto his. The rustling stopped, the corn stilling, the air growing thick and cold. Sam stepped back, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The figure raised one twisted, bony hand, its fingers long and sharp, the tips dark with something wet and glistening. The corn behind it parted, rows of tall, twisted shapes emerging, their hollow eyes fixed on him, their limbs bending and cracking as they stepped closer, the dry leaves whispering around them.
Sam fired, the shotgun blast echoing across the empty fields, but the figures didn't flinch.
They moved closer, their hollow eyes gleaming, their limbs twisting and cracking as they stepped onto the porch, the wood creaking beneath their weight. He stumbled back into the house, slamming the door, his heart racing as the rustling rose again. Louder now, the walls shuddering, the windows rattling.
Then the whispers began, soft at first, then rising to a fevered pitch, their tangled words wrapping around his mind. Their voices thick with hunger. Sam backed into the corner, his breath coming in ragged gulps, his pulse a frantic drumbeat in his ears.
The windows cracked, the shadows stretching, the walls seeming to close in around him.
And as the door creaked open, the whispering voices filled the room, cold, dry hands reaching for him, their hollow eyes glinting in the darkness. Story 13. The Lighthouse Keeper's Secret. The old lighthouse stood alone on a rocky cliff, its withered stones battered by the relentless sea and wind.
For decades, it guided ships safely through the treacherous waters below, but the keeper's house had been abandoned for years, its windows boarded, the door locked tight against the storm. Marat, a journalist chasing a story about forgotten places, arrived just as a storm began to gather. The wind howled through the crags, rain lashing against the rocks, and the sky darkened with heavy clouds. Inside the keeper's house, the air was thick with salt and mildew, the wooden floor creaking beneath her boots.
She found a faded logbook on a rickety table, the pages yellow and brittle with age.
The entries detailed long nights spent tending the light, strange noises from the cliffs, and a growing dread that something watched from the shadows.
The last entry chilled Marat to her core. They are coming with the tide.
I must stay at the light. As the storm raged outside, Marat explored the lighthouse itself. The spiral staircase wound upward, the walls slick with damp, the light of while flickering dimly in the gathering darkness. At the top, she found the lantern room, its glass cracked and streaked with salt spray.
She shivered, the cold biting through her coat, and looked out across the roiling sea.
Suddenly, a shadow moved beneath the waves, a shape too large and unnatural to be a whale or a strong swollen wave. It lingered just beyond the rocky shore, its outline blurred and shifting like smoke on water. A low, mournful sound rose over the wind, a keening wail that seemed to seep from the rocks themselves.
Marat's heart hammered as the shadow crept closer, the water bubbling and churning. Then, from the darkness, figures emerged tall, thin shapes with eyes like burning coals, their bodies slick and shifting, half submerged in the water, but moving with unnatural grace. Marat stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat, as the ghostly shapes moved toward the lighthouse, their mournful cries echoing against the cliffs.
She raced down the stairs, the light flickering wildly, and slammed the door against the storm. The shadows pressed against the glass, their eyes glowing, the cold seeping through the wood. In the morning, the storm had passed, the sea calm and silent. The lighthouse stood dark and empty, its light extinguished, the keeper's house abandoned once more. But sometimes, at night, when the wind is just right, the mournful keening returns, drifting over the cliffs and the calm sea, a reminder that some secrets are better left buried beneath the waves.
Story 14. The Last Call. Henry was the night operator at the old telephone exchange, a relic from a forgotten era when calls were manually connected through a maze of wires and switches.
The building was a cavernous, dimly lit labyrinth, its walls thick with dust and the faint hum of ancient machinery. Most nights were quiet, the occasional static crackle or wrong number the only interruptions.
But tonight was different. At exactly midnight, the phone rang sharp, sudden, piercing the silence like a scream. Henry picked up, expecting silence or a prank.
Instead, a voice whispered on the other end, soft, breathless, and barely audible. "Help, please."
Henry strained to listen. The voice repeated the plea, the static crackling louder, the line trembling as if it was caught between worlds. Curiosity gnawed at him. He traced the call through the switchboard, the wires humming beneath his fingers, leading deeper into the labyrinth of circuits and cables.
But the number was unlisted, no address, no subscriber.
The voice came again, more urgent now, weaving stories of a woman trapped in the old asylum on the hill. Her voice laced with despair and fear.
Henry's heart pounded as the connection flickered, the line crackling with the sound of distant footsteps and faint cries. He grabbed his coat and flashlight, deciding to investigate despite the late hour.
Outside, the wind was sharp and biting, the streets deserted beneath a blanket of thick fog.
The asylum loomed ahead, its crumbling walls dark against the night sky, windows shattered, doors hanging open like empty mouths. Henry stepped inside, the air heavy with decay and something far older sorrow, anger and something worse.
As he moved through the silent halls, the whispers returned, echoing of the peeling walls, fragments of laughter, sobbing, the faint ringing of bells.
The building seemed to breathe around him, shadows shifting just beyond the reach of his flashlight. Suddenly, the voice came again, closer now, a soft wail just beyond the next door. Henry's hand trembled as he pushed it open.
The room was empty save for a broken chair and a cracked mirror. The voice rose to a desperate scream, then silence. Behind him, the door slammed shut.
The mirror's surface rippled, and in its depths, Henry saw a face pale, hollow-eyed, mouth stretched in a silent scream. The line went dead. Outside, the fog thickened, swallowing the asylum whole once more, leaving only the faint echo of a last desperate call.
Story 15. The Silent Village. Evelyn arrived at the village of Black Hollow on a bleak autumn afternoon.
The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The sky, a dull grey canopy, pressed low over the crooked rooftops. The village was deserted, or so it seemed. Doors hung ajar, windows dark and empty, and the faint sound of wind whispered through the narrow streets, carrying with it an unsettling silence that pressed on her ears. She called out, but her voice was swallowed by the stillness.
No footsteps responded, no shutters rattled. It was as if the village had exhaled and then held its breath, waiting.
Evelyn, a researcher investigating folklore, felt the weight of unseen eyes upon her as she wandered.
She found the town square, where the statue of a hooded figure stood, its face eroded, its stone hands clenched tightly around a cracked book.
That night, she stayed in the only inn still standing, its walls sagging and stained. Sleep was elusive, broken by faint whispers that seemed to come from the very walls, voices just beyond comprehension. At midnight, the silence shattered, the door creaked open,
and a cold draught swept through the room.
Evelyn's eyes snapped open to see shadows moving outside, figures gliding silently through the fog that had rolled in like a living thing. They gathered at the square, circling the statue in slow, deliberate patterns. Their faces were pale, eyes void of life, their mouths moving in silent chants. Evelyn's breath hitched as she realized they were watching her, their hollow eyes piercing the darkness. The whispers grew louder, pressing against her mind like a tide, pulling at the edges of her sanity. She fled into the fog, the village swallowing her screams as the figures closed in, their silent hymn rising in a dreadful crescendo. In Black Hollow, some secrets are kept not by locks or walls, but by the silence of those who never left.
Story 16. Beneath the Floorboards.
James had always been fascinated by the old Victorian house he'd inherited from his late aunt. Nestled at the end of a quiet street, it was a relic from another century, with creaking floorboards, stained glass windows, and shadows that seemed to linger long after sunset.
The first night, he lay awake, listening to the house settle the slow groans, the whispered sighs of wood shifting.
But soon, another sound began, faint tapping, like nails against the underside of the floor.
Curious, James pulled up a loose floorboard in the living room.
Beneath was a narrow crawl space filled with dust and forgotten trinkets,
but something else caught his eye. Stretches, deep and frantic, etched into the wooden beams below. That night, the tapping grew louder, more insistent.
James could swear he heard breathing, shallow and ragged, coming from beneath the floor.
He tried to ignore it, telling himself it was just the house, but sleep slipped away.
Over the next days, the noisy spread soft footsteps pacing beneath his feet, muffled whispers that vanished when he strained to listen.
His reflection in the window sometimes flickered with something that wasn't quite his own.
One evening,
drawn by a compulsion he couldn't explain, James tore up several floorboards. In the hollow below, he found a small, dust-covered box containing a bundle of letters, each written in a trembling hand.
They told a story of a child trapped beneath the house, hidden away by a desperate family long ago.
The final letter was smeared with something dark, the words trailing off into a plea. "Help me."
They are coming back. That night, as the rain hammered the roof, the tapping turned to pounding, the floor trembling beneath James's feet.
He felt cold fingers brush his ankles, heard a breath close to his ear.
He tried to flee, but the floorboards buckled, trapping him in darkness. The whispered voices closed in, calling his name, dragging him down into the depths beneath the house.
When morning came, the house was silent once more, its secrets buried just beneath the floorboards, waiting for the next curious soul to listen to the tapping. Story 17. The Forgotten Path.
Anna had always been drawn to the forest behind her grandmother's house, a vast, tangled expanse of ancient trees and moss-covered stones. The villagers spoke of a forgotten path hidden deep within, one that led nowhere and everywhere at once, a place where time folded in on itself.
One afternoon, with the sky heavy and grey, Anna found the entrance a narrow trail overgrown with brambles, marked only by a twisted, gnarled tree.
She stepped carefully onto the path, the air growing cooler, the sounds of the outside world fading into silence.
The deeper she walked, the more the forest seemed to change.
Shadows lengthened unnaturally, the trees bending closer as if whispering secrets. The mist thickened, curling around her ankles, soft voices murmuring in a language she didn't understand.
After what felt like hours, she reached a clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, cracked and covered in strange symbols.
As she approached, the ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and decay. Suddenly, she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, but no one was there. The whispers rose, surrounding her, pressing into her mind. She tried to turn back, but the path had vanished. Only trees and shadows remained. Panic set in as she realized the forest was no longer a place she could leave. The shadows stretched toward her, cold fingers brushing her skin, and the voices became screams echoing inside her head. When the villagers found her days later, she was seated at the edge of the forest, eyes wide and unseeing, whispering the ancient language over and over. The path was gone, swallowed by the woods once more, and sometimes when the wind is right, the forest hums with the voices of those who walked the forgotten path and never came back.
Story 18. The Clockmaker's Workshop. Elliot inherited a small, dusty workshop tucked away in the corner of an old town. Inside were dozens of Clock's grandfather clocks, pocket watches, and wall-mounted timepieces, all frozen at exactly midnight. The townsfolk whispered that the previous clockmaker had vanished without a trace, leaving the shop as if he'd stepped out for a moment, never to return. Curious and alone, Elliot began repairing the clocks, their gears creaking and springs unwinding after decades of silence.
But as he worked, strange things happened. The ticking would slow, then speed up, echoing like a heartbeat, and shadows flickered just beyond the edge of his vision.
One night, as the clock struck 12, Elliot noticed the hands on one ancient wall clock moving backwards.
The room grew colder, the air thick and heavy. The ticking deepened into a rhythmic chant, almost a whisper.
Elliot's reflection in the glass warped, his face elongating and twisting.
He tried to leave, but the door slammed shut. The clocks began to chime, each tolling a note that echoed through the workshop, wrapping around him like a suffocating coil. The hands on the clocks spun faster, time distorting, moments folding over themselves.
Elliot felt himself pulled into the clock's mechanisms, his body twisting and stretching as if he were becoming part of the gears.
The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the clockmaker's vanished face, staring back from a cracked mirror, eyes empty and hands frozen forever at midnight.
Story 19. The Shadows of Hollow Creek. David arrived in Hollow Creek, a small town nestled deep in a valley surrounded by towering pines.
The place had an eerie stillness, as if time itself hesitated there. Locals avoided speaking of the shadows that moved just beyond the edge of sight. David was a photographer, drawn by the town's abandoned buildings and misty mornings.
His first night was calm, but on the second, A strange feeling settled over him.
In his photos, dark shapes flickered in corners, figures that disappeared when he looked up. Each night, the shadows grew bolder, lurking just outside his window, slipping silently through empty streets.
His dreams twisted into nightmares of being watched, the trees whispering his name in a voice that was not quite human.
One evening,
David followed the shadows into the forest, deeper than he had ever dared before.
the trees closed around him, though thick with cold, and he saw them tall, slender forms with glowing eyes, waiting patiently, their faces hidden in darkness.
He tried to run, but the forest seemed endless, paths looping back on themselves.
The shadows whispered promises of release and oblivion, their cold hands reaching for him.
David's last photo was found on his camera, the lens cracked and smeared, showing nothing but an endless black void. Story 20. The Lighthouse at Hollow Bay.
Clara took the job as the sole keeper of the lighthouse at Hollow Bay, a remote outpost battered by wind and relentless fog.
The previous keeper had vanished without explanation, leaving behind an eerie silence and an unlit beacon.
The lighthouse was isolated, perched on jagged rocks with the ocean pounding beneath.
At first, Clara found solace in the rhythmic crashing of waves and the foghorn's mournful call.
But soon, strange things began. Whispers echoing through the fog, lights flickering in the distance, and shadows that seemed to move just beyond the beam of her lantern.
At night, the fog thickened, swallowing sound and sight.
Clara would hear footsteps on the rocky path below, but find no one when she looked.
The air grew colder, the darkness heavier, as if the night itself was watching.
One evening, as a storm rolled in, Clara climbed the spiral stairs to light the beacon.
Halfway up, she glimpsed a figure standing at the edge of the rocks, veiled, silent, eyes reflecting the lightning.
The figure beckoned, and as Clara hesitated, the fog pressed closer, swallowing the light, the sound, the world.
The next morning, the lighthouse stood empty, its light extinguished. The ocean calm but watching, waiting for the next keeper to answer the call of Hollow Bay. Story 21. The Winter Guest.
The village of Norhollow had always been quiet in the colder months.
Snow piled thick against the stone cottages, and the pine forest that surrounded the valley whispered with wind and ice.
By late December, the roads became impassable, and the world seemed to forget Norhollow existed. Elsa had returned to take care of her late grandfather's home, a drafty old farmhouse on the hill overlooking the village. She welcomed the isolation time to sort through his belongings and settle her own thoughts after a year of losses. It was on the third night that she noticed the footprints, fresh, deliberate, and leading in a slow arc from the woods to her doorstep, bare footprints in the snow, despite the bitter cold. They stopped at her front steps, where they seemed to stand motionless for several minutes before vanishing into nothing. She searched but found no sign of trespassers. No one had seen anything. The villagers, distant and reserved, warned her not to go out at night. When she pressed, they said only, "He walks when the snow is deepest." Each night, the footprints returned, sometimes circling the house, sometimes stopping beneath her window. They never came from the same direction, never showed where they went. Inside, the house grew colder, though the fire never seemed to go out. Shadows pulled in corners that should have been empty. The mirror in the upstairs hall began to fog from the inside, faint handprints blooming on the glass without a soul touching it.
She began to dream of a man standing at the tree line and moving, watching. He was tall, gaunt, with frost clinging to his shoulders and eyes like polished stone. In the dream, he would speak without opening his mouth. You left the door open. One night, as a blizzard rolled in and the snow climbed past her windows, Elsa awoke to find the front door ajar. No wind blew in, no snow drifted across the threshold, just silence, and the trail of wood footprints leading into the house. They went up the stairs. She followed slowly, her breath a ghost in the air, the house crackling in the cold. She reached the hallway mirror, the one her grandfather had always kept covered. Now it stood uncovered. The frost on the inside formed a perfect outline of a figure standing just behind her. She turned, and there was nothing. But when she looked again, there were two reflections in the glass. Elsa was never seen in the village again.
But sometimes, when the snow lies heavy and the winds howl down from the forest, villagers say they see two sets of footprints in the snow, walking side by side, then vanishing into the woods. The winter guest is never alone now.